So I have that soccer ball drying, and while that's drying, I'm going to start working on the very, very thin veneer I'm going to make to put on the outside of the ball. And this has to be cut thin enough that light can shine through it, which is fairly thin. I've done a couple of these projects before with the light shining through thin lumber, and it looks awesome, but there is a little bit of trial and error to get it right. So I have some, this was actually a Douglas fir 2x6, which I had it planed down for another project, and then I just ripped off either side to get rid of that kind of curved over edges, so they're nice square pieces. I went with Douglas fir because it has more of a reddish pinkish hue to it versus pine, which is stark white, and since this is going to be most likely clear coated, I wanted something that when you put a finish on it, it doesn't yellow as much as pine, because I just don't find that to be a super attractive look. So I went with this Douglas fir because it has some reddish pinkish streaks in it, and it should look a little bit nicer. My widest dimension for my shapes is going to be 2.5. So I'm going to cut this into 2 3/4 strips before I start ripping it into veneer, just so that I could get strips closer to my final size. Now ideally I could rip this into 2.5-inch strips and then not have to cut 2 sides of that hexagon, but I've made a lot of veneer before, and a lot of times towards the edges of each side, especially if your wood's not perfectly flat, it'll kind of fray and tear. So it's easier to just make it oversized and avoid having a bunch of messed up pieces. So I have my blade set to 2.5, and I'm going to start ripping these into strips. I'm only going to do a couple because once you one strip of this cut down 2x6 is going to make most of the pieces I need for this project. So I put my featherboard in there. I move my fence over to cut the slightest of a sliver off of each of these pieces of wood. I'm going to have to keep moving it over as I go. And this is mainly trial and error. I'm going to cut this one, see if that works, and then just keep on moving down the line. So there is that piece, and planing this down really helps. If you start doing this off of rough lumber, you usually have a couple throwaway pieces in the beginning because the surfaces just aren't super flat. So that's nice and thin. It's thinner than a 1/16 of an inch, and the best way to tell if this is going to let the light shine through is to hold it up to a light source, which I happen to have in here. And you could see when I hold it up to that light that the color that's coming through is a pinkish red versus the regular pine that the light is made up of, which is that kind of yellowish, whitish. So this is going to be thin enough, and I'm just going to cut a bunch of these strips. That soccer ball the next day with all the tape removed. Removing the tape was actually quite tedious because these openings are not super large anymore. But I managed to get it all off, and now I'm going to start cutting down these angles. I have this very poorly operating belt sander that someone gave me out of the trash, but I think because this is MDF, this might actually work kind of well. I'm going to give that a go before I use some sort of hand sander, just because it will be easier to get this as close to circular as possible when using 2 hands instead of 1. Initial approach to this is going to be where those 3 edges meet. There's a triangular shaped point. I'm going to knock that down, and then once those are all knocked down, where the 2 edges meet, there's a roof shaped pitch point, and I'm going to knock that down. Now this is going to be covered, so I'm going to try and get it as circular as possible, but obviously with this method it is never going to be a perfect circle. So I'm going to kind of give this a go and see how it works and maybe change that plan if this goes terribly. So I've been going at that for a little bit with that belt sander, and it is working, but it's taking a really, really long time. So I think I'm going to put some 60 grit sandpaper in my orbital sander and see how that works before I commit to doing it with this belt sander. So the orbital sander is definitely going faster, and with it resting in this tape holder, I actually have a decent amount of control. Also, the nice thing is there are some hairline cracks throughout this whole piece, but they must be towards the surface because as I sand the edges down, the cracks pretty much all but disappear. So I think this is just going to take a little bit longer than I originally hoped. It would have taken much longer with plywood, so I'm super happy I made it out of MDF. And I'm just going to keep going around and sanding these pieces. And the spots I already hit are almost pretty good. I just want to keep going at it. So this is where I'm at after that initial round of sanding, and I switched the pad on my sander to a new one, and it's actually going fairly quickly, and the results are coming out pretty nice. So you could still see how there's high points, obviously, where these corners meet, and the nice thing about MDF, and you can see it pretty well in the camera, is where I've sanded is now rough, where I haven't touched is still that smooth MDF texture. So what I'm going to do now is continue sanding and take these down, try and sand these down to either side. Instead of just taking down that point, I'm going to start feathering it out to either side to get this more round. It doesn't have to be perfectly circular, but I do want it to be a little bit rounder. But picking this one pentagon, which will have 6 hexagons around it, and sanding the same way each time is really making this go quite smoothly. So this is that ball after all that sanding, and there's still some high spots, and the best way to tell where you have high spots is to put it on a flat surface with not a lot of clutter in the background, and if you look over it, the edge you'll be able to see lumps and high spots, and as you spin it you could see other ones. This doesn't have a ton, but I think I'm still going to do a little bit more fine tuning on it. So my original plan to finish this soccer ball was to make super thin veneer like this. And I'm going to show you how to make this. I already cut it, and I'll show you later in the video how I cut it. That is thin enough for light to shine through. Then once I had this skeleton, I was going to cover the entire ball with two different types of wood, one for the hexagons, one for the pentagons, and since it's really thin veneer, you can bend it and curve it around this ball. But as I was sanding this, and I had plenty of time to think about it, I just really liked the look of this skeleton, and it just seemed like a shame to cover up. And since it's going to be a light, even if you cover the whole thing, you're still only going to see the light coming out to these small sections. So I thought of insetting those pieces of wood into the ball. And I think I kind of did a couple practice tests here. I have decided if I want it fully inset like this one, or more on the surface like this one, but these are easy enough to make. I could make 20 of them and test out the lights, which is probably what I'll do. That way you'll still see the skeleton, it'll still function as a light. Now the only change that means is that this skeleton's going to have to be painted. I'm not going to keep it MDF, and the nice part about that is once I sand it, there's literally only like 3 little spots where there's cracks I'll have to fill with putty, which will not be hard. The rest of it's all pretty seamless. Since this is a trophy, I'm pretty positive I'm going to paint this gold, so that's not a big issue. But that means tomorrow when I go back in and sand it, I'm going to have to sand this down to a finer grit sandpaper, and then I'll probably start testing out these lights. So what I'm going to do now is, since I'm going to paint this gold, I'm probably going to spray paint it. But before I spray paint it gold, I'm going to put some primer on it, and that's because now that I've gone through and sanded this MDF, it's very fuzzy, and this MDF is going to absorb a ton of paint. So if you just spray paint it now, it's going to have a terrible finish. I have some kills, I'm going to prime it, and in between each layer of primer I'll lightly sand it until it's a smooth surface, and then I'll go through and spray paint it. Now the way to make this easier for me is I took a piece of wire and attached this little dowel to it, so I could slip this dowel in like this and hang it probably from my ceiling so I could paint the whole thing in the round at once. This is that ball after a coat of paint, and the problem with the paint, with the normal paint, is even though it will coat this MDF really well, it is blotchy. So I had to go through all these shapes you could see and sand the inside of them as well as the outside, which is super time consuming. But now that I have a nice even coat on the whole thing, I'm going to switch to spray paint, lightly sand in between each coat, and get this to a nice even finish. And that will make it ready for the gold spray paint. I sprayed that soccer ball again today. I think I have 3 coats of gold on there, and this brand spray paint is different than the primer, and it's filling in the holes much better than that other primer. And I think that that's just about done. I'm going to let it dry for a good 24, maybe even 48 hours to make sure the paint on there is super dry before I start putting the inserts in there. So while that's drying, the top of that is going to have that HoneyBadger carving, and I probably should have started this a while ago because these sorts of things, I always think they're going to go quickly and they never do. But I have this piece of basswood left over from a carving I did a couple years ago, and I found a picture of a HoneyBadger that I like, and I just traced that profile on the side of this. I actually am going to leave a little bit more on there because even though I like this photo, I kind of think I want to detail more of the tail and rear legs, so I'm going to leave some room for that on there. And then I came to the front and kind of tapered it because where the head and the body will be, you could cut off that excess. I'm going to take this to the bandsaw. I'm going to start rough carving this out and then switch over to hand tools once I have a rough shape. I'm probably not going to film a ton of the carving with a ton of explanation. So I had all my sheets of veneer cut and ready to go for when that soccer ball is dry. I could start inserting them. And in the meantime, I had started another project and I needed some 2x6s. While I was picking out some 2x6s at the lumber store, I found this one that just has this incredible figure and grain pattern to it in the store. You could find these sometimes with a little bit of this, but for the whole 2x6 to be covered with that, it's not super common. So I ended up picking it up, and I'm going to recut that veneer and use this grain patterned one. It's a little bit more work, but this pattern I think is just going to look really cool in that soccer ball, so it's worth it. I'm going to start cutting this up the exact same way I did earlier in the video, and then so I let that spray paint dry for about 24 hours, and now as you can see, I'm slowly inserting my pieces into I'm doing the hexagons first, and I decided to have them inset like that. First off, because I like the way it looked better, but also because they're not going to be perfect in this hole, mostly because there's 3 or 4 layers of white paint, 3 or 4 layers of gold paint, and it went in there unevenly, so now the holes are not all super uniform, and cutting each of those to match perfectly on the top would just be way too much work. So you're kind of given a little bit of leeway by sinking them in the holes. So what I did was I took one of my leftover originals and I took a piece of my veneer and I traced this onto the veneer and cut it out. And I'm using an X-Acto knife to do that because you get a real nice edge. And then once that fit in the hole, I'm now using this as my pattern for all of the others. And there's some of them you do have a little bit of tweaking just because, like I said, they're not super uniform now. But in general, they're going in there fairly well. And then I'm mixing up some epoxy, putting it on the inside edge of all of these and sliding those in. You kind of see the epoxy here. So I misspoke earlier when I said I had 4 sets left to go. I actually had 3 sets left to go. I said math wasn't my strong suit in the beginning of this video. So with 3 sets done, that means I have 15 hexagons done, and I have 5 more left, which is what I'm at now. You can see how that is turning out. However, there are 4 left on one side here, and then 1 solo one left here. This one I'm keeping open because that's how the light source is going to get into the piece, and this is going to sit in a base like this, so you won't even notice that that one's not there. So I'm going to do these last 4 and then switch to focusing on the pentagons. So here this is with all of those hexagons in place except for that one for the light source. And the nice thing about this was when I first started doing this, I really thought it was going to take all afternoon, but it only ended up taking about 2 hours, which is not bad at all. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start working on the pentagons, and I want a contrasting color in there, but I really like the grain pattern of the wood I have. So instead of using another color wood, I think what I'm going to try first is staining a piece of this veneer very, very, very lightly. I'm barely going to let the color soak in. I have a color. This is from another project, and it's actually a color I mixed. It's 2 stains, and it's kind of a brownish red. So I'm going to coat this piece and see if the light still filters through it the way I want it to, even with it coated. And if that works, then I'll start doing the pentagons in the exact same way I did the hexagons. The hexagons, this strip is about 3 to 4 feet long, and the hexagons only used up 1 strip, so it doesn't use up a ton. So, I tested that piece for the pentagons I stained over the light, and the light still shines through it. It doesn't shine through as well, obviously, because it's darker, but that's the way it's going to be with any wood. The light's going to shine through better through lighter lumber. So I lightly sanded it, and now I'm going through and doing the pentagons, and it's actually a little easier than I thought, and that is mainly because my finger is long enough that I could stick it through one of the pentagons and hold this in place and push it through. And then once you get to the bottom with that open hexagon, these last 3 are easy because you could use that to get them. So I'm kind of working my way around the top, so I always have an open hole and then till I get towards the bottom. And it's basically the same process. I made an original. I'm cutting them out using an X-Acto knife and then placing them in the soccer ball.